Good morning. It is my honor to introduce Professor Beatrice de Gelder, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience in the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and a member of the Maastricht Brain Imaging Center. Prior to her current assignments, she was a senior scientist at the Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging, Harvard University. She received an MA in philosophy, an MA in experimental psychology, and a PhD in philosophy from Leuven University in Belgium. Her current research focuses on face and body recognition, and recently on the neuroscience of art. Her research has resulted in over 250 peer-reviewed articles and 25 invited chapters. She has authored or co-authored 4 professional books, including her book on emotions and the body. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beatrice de Gelder.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back in Istanbul. I mean, that's and especially on this occasion. So I'm really having a wonderful time, and I hope I can give you a little bit of a good time in the coming hour. I will try to skip a bunch of technical details. Of course, you can ask me questions anytime you want, because I may know very little about the technical details you are interested in, and you may not be interested in the technical details I can provide. So let's see if we find some consensus between all of us. This is the gadget that does it. So we all know that body perception is very important, and it's much more important than the literature so far lets us to believe, because face perception is important, and I worked a bit on that before, but then one day I said, hey, what about the rest of the body? What about the whole body? Because, of course, a lot of information, non-verbal information, is exchanged, is conveyed by simply watching from a certain distance how people behave, what people express. I try to avoid, out of some kind of puritanical tendency, to avoid talking about emotions, and I tend to talk about body expressions, because my serious colleagues in neuroscience, they usually turn their back as soon as you talk about emotion. But I mean, basically, what I'm showing you are emotional expressions of bodies, right? And here, for example, we do a lot of work on defense reactions. And here already for defense reactions, you see that there are very different defense reactions. You can have a defense reaction when you see a snake coming. You can have a defense reaction when somebody is likely to attack you. You can have a defense reaction when there is a stone coming your way. So defense reactions already are very complex in themselves. So the main part of my activity is to understand how the brain deals with defense reactions. How the brain deals with body language, part of them defense reactions, because there is a lot of evidence about them. So what do we know about how the brain, and that's going to be my main topic, of course, how does the brain recognize and process and deals with the kind of very important, socially very relevant whole body reactions. You already see where I'm coming from and where I'm going, because you see, if you look very carefully, that the faces are blanked out on these images. So we always use full body. We always use full body expressions, not like just gesture or movement, full body expressions with the faces blanked out as naturally as we can make it. Okay? So there has been some work, or since the last 20 years, there has been some work on how the body deals with, how the brain deals with bodies. And we know, both from humans and from non-human primates, that the brain is well equipped to deal with body expressions. Not just you all agree the brain is very well equipped, very well prepared to face faces, to be in front of faces, to process facial information. But the body is just as well equipped, much less noun, but just as well equipped to deal with conspecific body behavior. Okay. Two areas in the brain have been pinpointed. One specifically, which is called EBA, and it's extrastriate body area. It's an area in extrastriate cortex, which is present very much in humans as in monkeys. So the question then is, because we are luckily long past beyond the stage in our science that finding an area that does something is considered to be important. Just finding an area, like 20 years ago, people started using fMRI, they found an area and they said, we've explained it. I mean, nobody in his or her right mind can believe that you have an explanation of a behavior when you find an area in the brain that supposedly does that. So and certainly in my lab, in my group, we are not going to make you believe that finding an area that does something explains anything. I mean, you really have to know what is the behavior and the computational function of that area. What are the features of the body it codes? What is the connectivity between areas and things like that? And indeed, when you look at my next slide, this is from a paper we published 3 years ago, you already see there, for still images, you just don't have one area as people originally thought, but you have already a bunch of areas. And moreover, if you go to dynamic images, you see that you get even more areas. So that clearly illustrates that finding an area that does something is not an explanation, because you really want to know what are the computations that are being done in that area or in those areas, and that's what my work is about. And so we have multiple. The more areas we find that are sensitive to bodies, the more the question arises: what do they do? How do they collaborate? And do they collaborate? And for example, here, not only do we have multiple areas, but even those individual ones of the multiple areas, they have connections to each other. So understanding how the brain deals with bodies is clearly a very complicated affair, because you need to now answer all those questions that I listed. So how do we go about dealing with images? This is from a little paper we published a couple of months ago, which was actually just a behavioral study, when we try to compare what people understand for the same action when the action is shown in video, still or partly scrambled. And the point of this slide is to convey to you that it's not just a matter of making the stimulus more rich. Like a still image is less rich than a moving image. But you see that for some, if you quickly scan this slide, you see that for some actions, the difference between still and video doesn't matter very much. So for some actions, you cannot read very much this. So the first one is self-protecting action. It's like self-protecting. Where the video conveys more than the still, the gray bar, but the scrambled you can still see a lot. I mean, which suggests that the brain extracts fairly elementary information to still get the image. For other ones, like here, expressing frustration. I mean, it's not anger; it's like frustration behavior. There you see that. Dynamic version conveys much more information than the still one, etc. So it's furthermore, even for what we have found, and that's was a little bit upsetting for us, we find that even for simple actions like taking a defensive posture, people do not always well understand these everyday actions. So there is a big difference, and interestingly, when you show a brief video of like a self-defensive action, the people don't understand it. But they don't understand it. That means they don't give you the meaning of the action directly. They will refer to the body part. They will say the arms are moving instead of he is afraid. When you understand an action, you'll say that's a sign of being afraid. When you don't understand the action, say the arms move up. So there are all sorts of interesting questions there that we need to address. And that really comes back to the question, which specific body information is actually critical for action and emotion understanding? And that's, of course, the target of our study. You could look at local shape features. You could look at body shape plus posture. You could even go down and look at optic flow. Or you could go down and look at joint angle trajectories. I mean, there's very many ways. You certainly know better than me what the different ways are to describe. And then you get, then you have, of course, the question of the hierarchy in descriptions. The high level, you have high level semantic features, which we all know. They are the action category, the emotion, the social relevance, the motion style, space. And what people in neuroscience have traditionally tried to do and still try to do is find brain correlates for those high level semantic features. Say, angry bodies is there. Okay? Fearful body expressions are there. Curiosity body expressions are there, just like people have tried to do for faces. Okay? But, of course, you have the standard question of how do these big semantic categories relate to mid-level features and how do they relate to low-level features. And the traditional way of doing this is what you see in the bottom right here is a small version of an image of how the brain works, which is old, but is still, the Feldman and Van Essen is still the most quoted paper on how the brain deals with visual images. And I'm not showing you here just to give you an idea, in case you're not familiar with that, of the level of complexity. I mean, every little color you see there. Is that working? Oop. It doesn't come across the scene very well. Anyway, every little color.
You can use this. Also.
Oh, yeah.
No, only here.
It doesn't matter. So every little color you see in the diagram is a brain area, and you see the number of connections that already in those days were hypothesized between those areas. Okay, so basically, and then that's what people have been trying to do. I mean, find the areas and then find the connections between them, and then realizing that you have feedback, feed forward, lateral, etc., etc. So something that's still the standard approach in neuroscience, but it's not the approach we would. It's not the way we would like to go. And that's as that shows you. Instead, what I'm going to present you is a bunch of different approaches, and they are complementary. First, I'm going to talk about some work that's going on where we use data-driven network level activities. Then I'm going to talk about some pose-based work on video analysis. And finally, I'll talk about encoding models we use for analyzing how the brain deals with bodies. So in part 1 and 2, we are talking about using naturalistic videos and finding ways to quantify the information in naturalistic videos such that we can relate the quantification to the brain. Okay, but in section 3 I'm going to talk in something that's actually different, also measuring body movement, but a bit different in the sense that there we try to start with stimuli that are already measurable. We don't start with videos and we try to measure the videos, but in that approach, we start we created model-based avatars. So in a way, we already inject the measurability into the stimuli rather than measuring naturalistic videos. So first part, what do I mean by data-driven network level activities? Are these guys playing? Yes, they are playing, but I won't know. So what we do here is not starting by finding areas in the brain that are sensitive to bodies versus faces or anything like that, but start in a completely bottom-up way and finding bottom-up methods to use to find irregularities in the brain representation. So we use independent component analysis to extract networks and time course modeling, and I'm going to show you how we do that. Sorry. So this was a study we did together with computer and monkey people, and we have these kinds of stimuli. We use actually the comparison with animal bodies to as a direct constraint on body representation in the human brain, because they are of course the closest related category. And we have, as you see in the next one, we have also object categories. So we have 20 monkeys, 20 humans, 20 faces, 20 objects, and we have scrambled versions. It's sort of a complicated design. We use 7 Tesla scanning to find out. And the goal really is completely bottom-up. Are there networks, among all the possible networks, do we find networks that actually at the network level, not at the area level, but at the network level, code for bodies? And we came up with 75 networks, and 2 of them show significant body modulation. Okay, so we find a network in the brain that is sensitive to the human body. I should add that we found a network that's sensitive to the human body. That still doesn't tell us, of course, what that network codes, but that's a different kind of job. But we find that it's really a network level. So it's not an addition of areas, but it's a network in the sense that what presumably codes for the specificity of the human body is the relations between the nodes and not the individual nodes. So this is a more detailed picture of the same thing. What we find here, of course, is consistent with earlier studies that use a more localized approach, but we also find other nodes in that network. Then the next thing is to look at the network level for connectivity influenced by specific body conditions. And here we use we use different kinds of stimuli, and we try to find I hope I can make this clear. It's a very simple idea. Rather than first saying that area codes for bodies and how is that area modulated by seeing a defensive or an aggressive body, we look at how is the network as such modulated by the body conditions. Okay. Yes. So we have those 2 networks, and they all code a little bit for monkey bodies, and they code a little bit for faces. But overall, statistically, they code specifically for the human body. And then that same network. Oh, sorry, right. So that also allows us, interestingly, to unpack these areas in areas that are specialized for the kind of body expressions we are interested in. Like here you see it's aggressive, neutral, fear. We use with those we use usually main expressions, mainstream expressions like fear and aggression. Okay, so. The interesting question then is what we find as specific, for example, for defensive body expression, how does that relate to earlier work where people specifically used category methods? And we find there is an interesting overlap, but also a much richer picture than where had we used traditional category-based approach. So that's one thing. Let's now go to the kind of different analysis, but in line with that, namely pose-based video analysis. I have 2 studies I would like to mention to you that use pose-based video analysis. Our first one used actually what I now call intuitive literature-guided feature definition. I mean, when you look at the older literature, they will say when the arm is stretched up, it is surprise or things like that. So once we wanted to do this pose-based video analysis, the question was, of course, what shall the features be? Okay? So we looked at some simple ones like the kinematics. That is readable. It's not too. At simple ones like kinematics, like velocity, acceleration, vertical movement, and then we tried to make up some based on the literature and based on our intuitions to sort of think what are the features that are characteristic for these postures. So these are short video clips. They are like 1 second, and as I said, kinematics gives us a way of looking for features, but we had to complement this with some kind of more or less intuitive analysis of the body postures. Like we thought symmetry might be an important. This was actually really educated guessing on our part. What would be relevant to characterize the differences between these two? And given that we had the pose analysis, we could calculate the features. And we came up, like for example, a shoulder ratio. I mean, when you measure the shoulder distance from the pose, like people are turned aggressively towards you, that ratio is like smaller. And one that turned out to be very promising was limb contraction, but those are really features that we made up based on our intuitions of what is relevant. Then we could, of course, do RSA analysis on these, and as you can see here, the categories, of course, gives very neat distinctions, but once you look at, you calculate representational similarity in terms of velocity, acceleration, symmetry, limb angle, vertical movement, shoulder ratio, overall surface of the body, and limb contraction. You do see immediately here that the 4 neat common sense emotion categories like that you have there in the top left, anger, happiness, neutral, and fear, you don't find that structure very easily once you look at coding at the level of those features. Okay? And that's, of course, an interesting observation. For example, if you look at limb angles, you see that there is some suggestion for structure there, but nothing as neat as what you find in the top left one. So that's the best we had to work with, and then the goal was, of course, how can we relate the similarity analysis, the feature-based similarity analysis, how can we relate it to brain data? And this is 3 Tesla, yes. So the way we do this, of course, to summarize, is we have the video analysis, we have the pose analysis of the videos, we have the RSA of the features. Then we go to the brain data, and we see how we can, to put it very intuitively, how we can map the results of the RSA of the stimulus analysis onto the brain activity. And that works reasonably well. And what I mean by reasonably well is that we clearly see that independently of other considerations, that we clearly see that the kinds of activities we find in the brain, for example, for one limb contraction, which is anger, when the limbs are contracted, it coincides with a definition of angry body expression, and the brain activity related to that feature-based analysis gives us a result that makes sense in view of the literature, of the older literature, where that... What is happening? Sorry. My fingers are too fast. Sorry, I lost my, yes, okay, here we are. So you see that in the right panels on the image, you see, for example, that the areas, insula, for example, but also IPPS, that kinds of areas you get which here characterize limb contraction, are the areas we know from the literature that looked at anger, rather than going to the level of the features. And we see something more than that. So there is a nice convergence, at least, between the older analysis. I mean, we don't find completely different things. We find the same thing, but we get a much richer and a much more rational picture that tells us already a little bit about what is coded in the brain. Okay? Because rather than saying the brain codes for anger, we now can say the brain codes for limb contraction, and limb contraction is calculated in this and that way. So now we were not entirely happy with this intuitive definition of features, as you see there on the left. That's the one we used before, and we said, well, let's do something that depends. Let's do a kind of analysis that depends less on our intuitions, on our common sense kind of understanding of what makes an angry body look with the kind of properties it has. So here, in the next talk, in the next study I'm talking about, we use sorry for my spelling here. We use computational-based feature search. So we said, rather than challenging our intuitions and looking for the literature, let's just throw it all into a system that will calculate features for us. So again, we started with videos that were analyzed with open pose to extract the positions of the key points. We applied some stimulus reduction techniques. We used in parallel two methods. One was hierarchical clustering, and the other one was sparse principal component analysis. We did not yet choose which one we preferred. We thought, well, let's just run the two and see what they give and how they would possibly relate to each other. So that's more or less the procedure that was used. I mean, I can talk in detail about that. So this was 3 Tesla, and but here, so we have either methods used based on principal component analysis or on hierarchical clustering on the one hand, and we have the brain data on the other hand, and we try to see what goes first. Here you have the key point. First, of course, is always the open pose key point analysis. Then we have, on the one hand, hierarchical clustering methods, and on the other hand, principal component analysis to work on the open pose key points, of course. Then we get to feature RDMs. On the other hand, on the other leg is collect data from the fMRI, do univariate analysis and searchlight. Then get to first neural RDM, first order neural RDMs, and then of course the critical question: how can we now relate the first order feature RDMs to the first order neural RDMs? Okay? And that's of course the critical question: can we relate those two, and what does that yield us? This is work in progress. We have not yet decided which one we will prefer in the end. I think we will gonna keep both, because of course, as you know and certainly agree with me, any kind of computational analysis comes at a price. One gives you some data, the other gives you another data, set of data and approaches. But our question, of course, is to see what is best at explaining our brain data. See, so our preference for one or another methodological approach or computational approach is ultimately driven by how well does it explain the variability in the brain data. And of course, that's not a constraint imposed on any kind of work. It's not a constraint on computer vision work, for example. But for us, it's really how well does it explain the brain data? How well does it explain the variability in the brain data? One example here that illustrates that situation is, for example, here for that kind of video, which, as I said, is pose-analyzed and then, on the one hand, analyzed with hierarchical clustering, on the other hand, with sparse PCA. And we see that there is some difference and some overlap. The arrows in this picture are not like the simplest one, but you can see that in the hierarchical clustering as well in PCA, we see that the area on the left is sensitive to the right arm. The area on the right in hierarchical clustering is sensitive to the right leg, left arm, and in PCA that is sensitive to the left hand and the right foot. So there is some overlap between what we get in the brain data concerning what results from using hierarchical clustering to map the brain data and what we get between sparse PCA and the brain data. But I mean, we run these two in parallel to see which the question is, of course, even if it's hierarchical clustering or sparse PCA, whether what we get makes sense given the background literature we have on that. And it's interesting to see that the area you see here in both actually is anterior cingulate cortex, is one area that you saw coming up in the previous analysis, which used intuitive features, is the area ACC that you see there in the left bottom figure. That's the same area then you get. That one, what we get here. Okay. So there is some specificity overlap. What's quite interesting here is that we're in the hierarchical clustering and in sparse PCA we don't get specific features. We get already combinations of features, like for example right left. What comes out in the HC is a combination of right leg and left arm, which maybe the video doesn't play anymore now, but which you see actually in the video as going together. Okay. So that's one method we are currently working on, using this, rather than defining intuitive features ourselves, see what features are generated by hierarchical clustering or by sparse PCA, and see how well that maps onto the data. Good. How am I doing for time? Oops. Now we get to more tricky stuff. Where we stop working. I mean, this work is going in parallel in the lab. The more tricky stuff is where we work with artificial stimuli. So as I said in part one, I've talked about what you could call data-driven network organization, where we basically argue, and I think that's already an important progress in the field, where we argue that the representation of a specific emotional expression is a network function. I mean, there are no emotion areas in the brain and no object areas in the brain. We find this network function for bodies and modulation of network functions for the specific emotions. Okay. Part two, I talked about intuitive first, and then computational movement features analysis, where we ultimately hope to find, the notion is that we might find that the representation of a specific emotional expression is based on some kind of feature fingerprints. What you would hope is that either PCA or hierarchical clustering gives you some kind of fingerprint for the specific emotional movements. Okay? But in part three, we do something different, ultimately rated with something different, because here we really ask what are actually the building blocks of used in approach 1 and 2. Because when we talk about features like limb contraction, we define a property of a body movement, but we don't really, we define the features. We can try to characterize the features like contraction here, but we have not yet talked about what are the building blocks of this body representation. What is it actually made of? And that's what we try to approximate an answer to that question. In this different approach. So here we talk about something that's that's a bit more complicated in terms of the brain analysis, but I'm trying to convey the meaning rather than the technical details. Okay. What we do here is use precisely parameterized human body stimuli, and we try to see whether we can find evidence for the parameter encoding in the brain. Okay, I'll immediately give examples, and then we test several feature encoding models based on data extracted from the stimuli, and we determine which is the best to predict the bold signal. Okay. This is these encoding models are always based on the notion that you train a model and then you test a model on a different data set. I mean, that's a kind of. But I'm not going to go too much into the details here. And this example will clarify it. So here we worked with images taken from Michael Black's stimulus set, and we created the advantage, of course, of working with these stimuli is that you have a full description of the stimuli in hand, right? So what we did is starting from there and creating a number of stimuli. Ultimately, we created 300 and something stimuli by varying by the distance from the origin. The center thing is the shell, and you can generate a body mesh and then define different body rotations, and that way you could do this. There's no limit to the number of stimuli you can generate. Here they are defined in terms of standard deviations from the shell in the center, but you can of course also work with central at 0 or left turned versus right turned. So you can create a whole bunch of stimuli with this. As I said, with the advantage that you know how they are made. As you know, the Michael Black stimuli are originally made from motion capture, and they are generated then in this way. Okay? So we ultimately decided to have 324 unique stimuli for this. They were made without any other concern than varying them along the dimensions that the model allowed us to vary them. Okay, this was a study done on 7 Tesla. These are sort of methodological details which I skip because that's a published paper by now. And so again here the idea is, the basic notion is to generate on the one hand your stimulus analysis, on the other hand your brain data, and then to see how you can bring the two together and what explains what here. Okay, this uses fairly complicated data analysis methods, which I'm going to skip. Basically, what the upshot of this is that we tried the different models to see which one best explained our brain data. We tried a key point 3 model, a key point 2 model, and a Gabor model. Because some people thought that everything that's going on in the brain ultimately can be explained by Gabor models. I mean, some people think that all the information is there, it's just a matter of extracting it. So what's interesting here is that there is, as you see here, there is no clear separation. There is a posterior to anterior gradient going from Gabor to two key point models. And what you see in the graph is how much of the variance is explained by the different models. Okay? So here, just repeating this maybe needlessly, but I'd like to make it clear, is we on the one hand we have this artificial stimuli avatars carefully created with their specific properties. On the other hand we have the brain data, and on top of that we have like specific models, and we test which of those models actually explain the variability in the brain data. Okay, and that's what you get. I mean, you might sort of naively expect it, like in my naive days, and there are many of those, I expect to find like some kind of separation in the brain between one model explains explains early, then a little 2 millimeters further in the brain, the next model kicks in, and it's not what you get. So all those, depending on where there is never an area where is one single model. There's never an area where it's all blue and then it becomes all red. So that same approach was done for the last study I'm going to report on, which is, I think, rather interesting. So are these guys going to play? So what we did now is move away from the Michael Black stimuli and go to stimuli that embodied a specific hypothesis we had. And that specific hypothesis is, let's see what the brain does with bodies in terms of its biomechanics. So we wanted to see at one because I showed you the previous area where the 2 key and the 3 key point, the 2 key point and the 3 key point model explains some of the variance in the data. Partially, not very well, but partially it explained, and there was a gradient from posterior to anterior, and that was a good try, but we were not entirely happy with it. And we said, what about actually creating stimuli based on the hypothesis that the brain is sensitive to the biomechanics of the movement? Okay? So to do that turned out to be a little bit more complicated because there is no study in the literature that gives you information about that. There are a couple of studies on biomechanics using still images, and what people have done, which is of course easy to do with still images, you just cut an arm, you glue it back in the opposite, glue it back in the wrong position on the body, and you have a biomechanically impossible posture. But we wanted biomechanically impossible movement. Okay? So we first had to have a model of the movement and then transform the images based on that body of the movement and on possible and impossible biomechanics. So I'm going to see if these guys play. Here you have four examples. 4 example stimuli, and you will see as soon as I make them move that 2 of them are impossible and 2 are possible. Let's see if they decide to move. Okay, so that's impossible. That is nicely possible. That is impossible. And that's possible. Clear? It's actually, we collected behavioral data because, of course, we wanted to know whether this was entirely clear for the participants before getting into the study. And it works mostly well, but an interesting observation, if I can go back and see if this one wants to play. An interesting thing, what you see here is that there's still some kind of holistic effect, because even if the arms move in impossible angles, overall you can still it was not that easy to make those impossible videos. There's still the overall movement that carries the. Anyway, good. Not going to the univariate case, that's not interesting. So we used a bunch of different models. Here we again used the key point position. We used key point rotations, and we used a model which is called which we call sim distance, which is a model that explicitly represents the biomechanical difference across stimuli. It encodes a distance metric expressed on a sum of Gaussian for each joint across possible videos, and thereby it represents a distribution of possible values that each joint can assume in a biomechanical plausible scenario, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so that's the model that we were going to test, whether how well it fitted with the data. We had 120 of those stimuli. They were repeated 6 times. You have to repeat and repeat and repeat. This was an fMRI study where people were in the scanner for 4 hours in the 7 Tesla. You may not be very happy with that, but it was needed to have to do this to do the amount of data where we can do this kind of analysis. So first of all, what do we get? First, we look at how all the 3 models together relate to the data. and we find that the three models together explain very nicely what we want them to display. I mean, they show activity in the areas where we want it to be, and it makes sense. It's nicely bilateral, which is interesting. So, taken together, the three models explain very well the brain activity. But of course, that's good, but what you want to know is one model better than the other, and where is one model doing its job? And therefore, you look at the percentage of variance that's actually explained by each model separately. And this gives some very, very nice pictures, very, very colorful. Istanbul bridge colored pictures, where you see in red is the key point 3 model. The green is the rotation, a model that only deals with the rotations, and the SIM model is the model that I described in the previous slide. So you see that in the areas where there is activity, there is a combination. This is from one subject. Because we do this at the individual subject level, you see that those areas are mostly is the key point 3 rotation model that explains best, but I'm not showing you the statistics. This is another subject where you see that there is some subjective difference, and one thing we are looking into now is, of course, what happens to the layers. Because here it looks it looks, and it is indeed the case, as I said in the previous study, it's not like one model goes till here in the brain and then the next model explains the next step. I mean, these models coexist at the level of the areas in the brain that are sensitive to bodies. We can be absolutely sure that different models coexist, and not a single model will explain most. Will explain everything. You see that here is the similarity model that explains better. Overall, it does, and it does as you go more anteriorly, while the key point 3 explains things a little bit more posteriorly. But then, of course, it depends on this. So anyway. So that's the kind of work that's going on, and we are pretty happy with this approach, although it is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to talk about this one here, because that brings us. We do key point analysis also for interactions now, but that's not what I was going to talk about here. I seem to have. Oh yes, here we go. So let me, yes. So to summarize, our goal was really to find at the feature level, to find first what are the features of whole body movements, then to see which of those features are important for conveying a specific emotional expression of the body, then to find where in the brain those features are coded, and then what are the computational properties, what kinds of computations are going on over those features, and then do we have a model of those computations, and if so, is that model of computations, is that a model that explains the variance in the data we observe when we do brain imaging? Okay? So these different approaches go together, and as I said, it's very much work in progress. Thanks to all the people here, we work with people from Tübingen, people from Monkey. We do this work in parallel with Monkey methodologies and computational methodologies. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this talk. So when you looked at the different representations, the Gabor versus the key point, for example, Would it make sense to use stimuli for which you can train, let's say, computational models, where you extract Gabor features or key point features and see whether the task you're setting to the model fails? For example, I would assume that when you have the impossible movements, the Gabor energy in the image might be very similar to a plausible movement. So the Gabor feature would fail in a computational model, whereas the key point-based representation would actually reveal the differences. So that would maybe inform what kind of representation you expect to be more successful also in the brain.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, but as you saw in the first study, in the first of the study of the third part, the Gabor doesn't explain much.
In that case.
In that case, yes.
Okay. Yes. So, but that is a paradigm that.
Yeah, that's absolutely, yes. So, I mean, we are actively looking for models that we can train on, that we can.
And then there is the question of the context. I mean, for faces, we now know that the context plays a huge role in interpreting, especially the emotional content. But most of your stimuli are disembodied, in a sense, like devoid of context. So, are we still measuring the correct thing, or is this something?
That's a different kind of question.
Yes.
We did some studies before we got into this kind of work. We did some studies where we showed bodies in context, and there's two findings there. Number one, the context in which a face, if you present, like we presented an angry face in the context of a birthday party, or a happy face in the context of a scene of a funeral, whatever. That's work we did 10 years ago. And yes, indeed, it makes a difference. On the other hand, when we presented, I remember that's a study we published in 2010, when we present the context alone, we also got activity in body areas. So that
doesn't affect the main conclusion.
It's not even a context effect, it's a scene effect. So the scene of a funeral, your brain expects to see people there with certain expressions, and that's what's going on. But that's not telling us much about. I mean, we are really now interested in like what is actually coded in the brain and what carries the information. Because to put this in the context of some different work, we are using a lot of virtual reality also. And in virtual reality, there is this notion that the more realistic the stimuli are, the better they will, the more convincing they will be. And I'm tempted to say, hey, why would that be the case? If you know exactly which aspects of the stimulus matter, you can have a very impoverished stimulus and still work with it. So that's also to go back to there is this hierarchy of levels that matter, and we don't know how it's constructed and what matters at this point. Thanks.
If there are no questions, I would like to ask a question. Do you think upper body movements and lower body movements are different, are processed differently by the brain? The upper body gestures, for example, are mostly communicative.
Yeah.
So I would think that they would have differently. Have you ever experimented with? Also, your intuitively designed features, they measure either upper body or different features for different parts of the body. So, have you ever, whereas PCA based or also the Michael Black features, PCA is lumping everything into a feature space. So have you thought of separating the upper body and the lower body?
No, we have not done that. What we do to limit the options is focus on specific expressions to work with. Like I said, aggressive and defensive postures. And for defensive postures, the ones we use, the placement of the feet and the legs matter as much as the protective arm movements. The same for the aggressive ones. But for other things, I mean, for people standing still in a conversation, if you work at gestures, people standing still in a conversation, then it's going to much more the upper body. But that's right now, as we saw in some of the examples, the upper body matters as much as the lower body. But that's a function of the kind of whole body selection we make. Yes.
Questions? Yes, please.
More a comment than a question, but I think there's definitely body models here. We have a body shape recognition model really trained for identification, but it does retain a lot of the pose information, as most networks do at the top level. But it would be really easy to take these bodies and run them through a visual transformer, for example, that's trained for body identification, and give you a representation that is out of the image space. Like, so it's not in the image domain anymore, but it's in the domain of, higher level things. So definitely I think there's really recently other body models to have a look at. So just a comment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's absolutely. I mean, I don't. There is a lot of information you can get from postures, and we're just focusing on the movement analysis. But as I said, it depends very much on the kind of actual behaviors, actually the range of body images you are dealing with, where the posture can convey a lot. We also have data on that, the still versus the moving ones, whether it matters. But we are just now focused on what can we do with movement and how can we analyze it and what are features of movement. Thanks.
If there are no further questions, I would like to invite Albert Ali Salah to thank our speaker.
Thank you very much.
I'm getting more fun.
Thank you. This concludes this session. We have now a coffee break outside.